Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to Allen & Overy. My name is Greg Brown. I'm the head of the Microfinance and Social Investment Group here. Very pleased to host this for the Microfinance Club UK. Very pleased to see so many of you here despite the balmy summer's evening, despite the cricket. It's good to see a good turnout. So we're very glad to have you here. After the talk, there will be some drinks and some canapes served in the room. You're very welcome to stay and join us for those, of course. But without further ado, let me hand over to Malcolm to introduce the event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be asked to chair this session because it's on a theme which I think is very topical and important. And we're extraordinarily lucky to have Mamouna Rashid, who's chair of the commission, which looked into the affairs of Grameen Bank and all the subsidiaries and so on, and mostly Ahmed, who was working on the same thing. We're extremely fortunate to have them here. I think there's an awful lot of, dare I say, nonsense being spoken on all sides about this whole controversy, which is a controversy, and I think it's a wonderful opportunity to have this extremely informed pair of people with us. I don't suppose as many of you in this room who've read the whole report. I've read rather quicker than I should have done, perhaps the 30-odd pages of the summary or whatever it was called. And with all due respects to our hosts, to who, as ever, I express my gratitude. Dare I say, I was saying about the content, I leave that to our speakers, but the writing style, shall I say, wish that every lawyer could write English as nicely as they do. It was a pleasure to read. And you can't say that about every report of that kind, even those that have been written within a few hundred yards of this place. And that's quite, actually, I think it's a major advantage to put over difficult things, but in good, clear English. It's a rare skill. But I'll leave you, gentlemen, to say what it was you put over. Mostly, you want to kick off?
Yes, shall I go over there?
Well, whatever you like. And we will have plenty of time for questions afterwards. We'll have questions, after the presentation, so store them up.
Good afternoon. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here, especially with so many distinguished people in the audience and with Malcolm Harper chairing. I know he's a very difficult chairperson to have, so we've got to be very, very careful as to what we say and how we justify to justify what we say. The presentation is going to be in two parts. I'm going to make a very brief background introduction as to how this commission came about. And Mamouna Rashid is going to make the presentation on the commission's work and the report. Many people think that Bangladesh government's intervention in Grameen Bank is a personal vendetta of the Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina against Dr. Yunus. It's for you to judge, but it is true that Dr. Yunus and our Prime Minister have very strained relationship between them, particularly when in 2007, Dr. Yunus expressed his desire to enter the political field and contest the election. There have been exchange of very harsh words between them, and the media really had a very good time publishing them. They called each other names in public. The Prime Minister called Dr. Yunus loan shark, or in Bangla it's called shoot-khor, which is much more derogatory and insulting than loan shark. And Dr. Yunus called the Prime Minister shoot-khor, which is somebody who takes bribe, which is also very insulting and derogatory. But there is more to it as to how this commission came about and why the commission was appointed. How do I go about this? In November 2010, a documentary film called Caught in the Middle of Debt was screened in Norway by the state television. In it, Dr. Yunus was accused of making an inappropriate transfer of NORAD grant in 1966 from Grameen Bank to one of the companies under his control. The documentary also stated NORAD objected. NORAD is a Norwegian government donor agency. They handle the Norwegian government development funds. They objected to the transfer, and Grameen Bank explained that it was done to reduce potential tax burden on the organization. NORAD asked the fund to be refunded, and Grameen Bank did so. BDnews24.com is a web-based news portal, published a report after the Norwegian broadcast under the caption, Yunus siphoned off 7 billion taka, which is around $90 million, aid for the poor. That is exactly what they said. All major newspapers in Bangladesh carried the news, and Bangladesh government's attention was drawn to the Grameen Bank's activities. While looking into the activities, the government found that Dr. Yunus had gone beyond his retirement age that is specified for a government-owned bank, for an MD, and they asked him to resign. When Dr. Yunus refused to do so, the government removed him from the position in 2011. Dr. Yunus went to the court contesting the government's action on the ground that Grameen Bank is a private bank and the age limit of 60 years applicable for an MD of a government bank did not apply to him. So the Supreme Court of Bangladesh ruled that Grameen Bank was a government bank and that age limit also applied to Dr. Yunus. Earlier this year, the government formed a committee to advertise internationally and select an MD for Grameen Bank. The committee advertised in the Economist magazine and received a number of applications. Dr. Yunus went to the court and stopped the committee from selecting an MD for Grameen Bank. Today, Grameen Bank is without an MD. One of the employees is acting as an MD over there. Its activities are limited to giving out loans and receiving loans. No major decisions are taken at the board level, as they are blocked by 9 women borrower shareholders who are directors of Grameen Bank who want Dr. Yunus to be, or his nominated person, to be restored as MD. On 31st of December 2010, Grameen Bank had 8.3 million members. 97% of them are female. 5.6 are allegedly borrower shareholders. And the deposit base of Grameen Bank is 100 billion taka, or 125 billion US dollars. And the loan portfolio was 68 billion taka, or US dollar 0.85 billion. The removal of Dr. Yunus from the leadership of Grameen Bank in 2011 by the government was a critical moment for Grameen Bank. There has been worldwide condemnation of government's action, and there has been a lot of discussion on Dr. Yunus and Grameen Bank's future. Bangladesh government set up the Grameen Bank Commission of Inquiry on 15th of May 2012. This is where the commission comes in. I'll let Mamuna Rashid take over now and present the rest of the slides.
Thank you, Mr. Excellent.
Professor Harper, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, happy to be here, try and explain what the Commission has been doing with regard to Grameen Bank. And as my colleague, Mr. Ahmed, has explained, there has been a lot of controversy about why at all Professor Yunus has been removed and what's going to happen to Grameen Bank once he's not there. Now, the notice to this, let's say, meeting today explains very briefly what the terms of reference are, what the government set out, asked us to do. And I will try and explain what we have done so far. The first part of our work was to deal with what Grameen Bank is. There has been a lot of controversy whether it's a government bank or whether it's a private bank. So we tried to look into that issue and try and settle that matter. The second part of our work has to deal with the possible future structure of Grameen Bank. And the third part, which we hope we'll be able to touch on, has to deal with the many organizations that Grameen Bank has sponsored, 52 or more of these organizations. How did they come about and what is their relationship with Grameen Bank itself? Coming back to the first part, our interim report, the first part report, deals with what Grameen Bank is.
You can just change the slide.
There's a keyboard.
Oh. I will,
And then if you go to the next.
yeah, I'll let what's written there be self-explanatory. If you have any questions on that, I think after what I have said, you can come back and I'll try and answer them. But I will, while this is on the board, let me go back to the earlier one. The commission, what has gone wrong with Grameen Bank incorporation, the change in share capital. We've dealt in the interim report with the legal status, the ownership, and the Grameen Bank shareholders. What are they? What is their nature with regard to the organization itself? If I go briefly over this, the legal status, the Supreme Court, Professor Yunus took the case to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that this is a government bank, it's not a private bank, and that shareholding in the bank itself have no relationship to who is the controlling authority of the bank itself. So that matter was settled effectively by the Supreme Court. In terms of its shareholding, the issue that has often been spoken about is that 97% of the shares are owned by women or their borrower shareholders, and that government owns only 3%. Therefore, how can the ownership vest in the government when the shares are held by people who are subscribed to its capital structure? Our finding, very briefly, is that the term share has not been defined in the Act or by any resolution of the board itself. So the share, as we understand it under the Companies Act, does not apply to Grameen Bank. It's merely a contribution to its capital. The only right that the Act provides the shareholders is the right to vote for a director. No other right has been implied or explicitly stated. Oh, okay. So, in terms of claiming ownership, oh, that's right. So, in terms of claiming ownership on behalf of the shareholders, our findings were this is incorrect. This was an organization created by statute, and it's the statute which determines the nature of the organization itself. The shares are not an evidence of ownership, and the shares have only the right to, shareholders have only the right to vote for a director. No other right has been granted to them. Other than the ownership issue, the management issue has been dealt with in the report. The report itself isn't very big. It's 66 pages, of which really the most important part is only about 15 to 20 pages, which deals with the legal structure and the ownership and finally the management. Now, we looked at Grameen Bank As it says here, it's a bank which was created to provide collateral-free credit to the landless people in Bangladesh. That in itself is not very innovative because the same experiment has been tried by other people. And Grameen Banks is really a follow-up on what a gentleman named Akhtar Hamid Khan, if you've heard about him, the Kumilla experiment. It's really a follow-up of what Akhtar Hamid Khan had already done in Kumilla back in the 50s and 60s. But he did put together a new scheme, a group lending, and he did focus on women. And he did find out that women are more creditworthy than men, particularly when there is group lending involved. The structure of Grameen Bank as it stands is that it originally started off with a 60-40 shareholding. The government had contributed 60%, and the borrower shareholders were supposed to contribute 40%. And the board was similarly structured. The majority was in the hands of the government. 6 were nominated by the government. 4 were nominated from amongst the borrower shareholders, again by the government. But in 1987, an amendment was made to the ordinance whereby the board composition shifted in favor of the borrower shareholders. 9 were supposed to be elected by the borrower shareholders, and only 3 were nominated by the government. Now, because this is a government body, the board of directors do not represent the owners. They only represent a group of interested persons on the board itself, decision-making board. Government's share at that time in 1986 effectively was reduced to 25%, and the borrower shareholders' contribution to its capital structure was increased to 75%. Between 86 and 2008, there were a number of changes in the paid-up capital structure, but none of these were authorized, duly authorized as provided under law. So effectively, when we examined the capital structure of the bank, we found that we could only accept the paid-up capital amounting to 72 million takas as being the valid capital contribution to the organization's capital base. Now, the question always arises, why was this bank registered under an ordinance and not created under the Companies Act? This question really arose when Professor Yunus claimed that because of the capital contribution of the borrower shareholders, it was effectively a private bank. We put the question to him that when he helped start the bank in 1983, there was sufficient evidence in the files to show that there was a proposal to launch this bank under the Companies Act, which would effectively have allowed it to be a private bank. He pulled back. He said, no, I want this bank started under an ordinance. So once it was started under an ordinance, there was little chance, given its capital structure, that it would be a private entity. Professor Yunus admitted that if it was registered under the Companies Act, the problem would be getting the shareholders to participate in an annual meeting and getting the shareholders to vote for directors, effectively vote for directors. So he actually pulled back from that stage. He now wants it to be converted into a private bank. That's all fine. In our second part of our report, we will deal with that issue. The issue is, if we do make it, suggest that the government make it a private bank, then how do we deal with these shareholders? He claims that there are as many as 8.3 million shareholders. And how do we deal with these shareholders? How do we give them the rights? How do we ask them to participate in the workings of the bank? That is an intractable problem. We don't know how to do it, and we are considering various options. this is what the appellate division has ruled. These are straight out of the judgment. There is no dispute that Grameen Bank has been established by statute. It's a statutory bank established by an ordinance, being controlled and regulated by the government. We find no substance that that Grameen Bank is a private bank. Grameen Bank is a statutory body, wholly under the control of the government, and regardless of the size of the contribution of the share capital by other parties, it will remain a government bank. We have stated what we have found out here. All right, we come to one other issue. The ordinance requires that rules be framed to manage Grameen Bank. The ordinance also states that these rules have to be approved by the board and then accepted by the government. And they are then gazetted and they become effective thereafter. It's unfortunate, but we found that other than one rule, none of the other rules which have been allegedly used to manage Grameen Bank were ever made known to the board or to the government. How that happened is something which regrettably we can only blame the government and the board for not having looked into. The only rule that was seen by the government and which was passed by them and gazetted was the directors' election rules. But there too they made a fundamental mistake, because the ordinance permits the borrower shareholder to vote for the directors. It does not permit an intermediary to vote for it. Whereas the rules, the way it was drafted, it's not the borrower shareholder who votes for the director. At an intermediate stage, certain selected people go ahead and then vote for the director. So the election rules itself became ultra vires of the ordinance. So we've proposed that the election rules be amended and that the borrower shareholders be permitted to vote directly for the directors, for the 9 directors that has been authorized under the ordinance. In the same line, as you can see, we have mentioned that certain other rules had been framed which govern the operations of Grameen Bank. None of them had ever been placed before the board. None of them had been passed by the board. None of them had been accepted by the government as being valid rules which would govern Grameen Bank. In fact, even the most fundamental of rules, which defines what a shareholder can do with his shares, was not known to the board. This is a slide which just explains how Grameen Bank is formed and what is the relationship. 5 or more people form a group. They have to be landless. They borrow money from whatever they have borrowed. If they have a savings, that savings is used to buy a share. They cannot buy more than a single share worth 100 takas. Once they have become a saver, they become a saver borrower shareholder, and there with the 100 taka share, they can go back and borrow from the bank again. So this cycle is repeated throughout the Grameen Bank structure. This is spelled out here. As you can see, the first 4 parts gives you 6 parts, tells you how Grameen Bank is managed through groups, through centers, through branches and zones. And the last part explains that the 40 zones are divided into 9 constituencies for electoral purposes, and that each of these constituencies is supposed to elect a director. And these 9 directors sit along with 3 senior government officials to form the board of directors of Grameen Bank. One revelation that we found when we asked the Grameen Bank board that how do you go about electing your directors? Now, they say they have an electoral base of 5 million to 8 million. The numbers vary depending on what you accept. So when we asked them, they said, oh, we have a balloting process, and that for the last 15 years, this is the way we've elected these 9 directors. But when we went and looked at the board minutes, because in the board minutes, this electoral process should have been spelt out. Every third year when the election takes place, who conducts the elections, what was the balloting results in each of these constituencies, we found there was no mention of the electoral process itself. In fact, when one of the chairmen asked the lady who had been elected to the board what was the process of her election, her statement is what we have put up here. This is what she said. The election process to become a director began when the branch manager asked me to meet him at the branch office. There I found the head of all other centers present. Because she was thought to be dynamic, she had leadership qualities, so the branch office manager nominated her to be the representative at the next level. Then the area manager similarly thought she was the most meritorious. He nominated her to be the area representative, and from there she went on to be a director. This was the standard pattern. There has never been an election under the guise of an election, this selection process taking place. And in this entire selection process, it's the bank management who determine who is going to be nominated to the board. It's hardly a free and fair exercise of their right to vote for the director. And this is a translation from the board minutes. It's what's been recorded in the board minutes. It's what Professor Yunus himself has recorded in the board. Now, other than the Grameen Bank itself, you're aware that 52 or more organizations were created by Grameen Bank. Amongst them, we have listed some of them out here. We went to look at the process of creating these organizations. Most of these have been registered as non-for-profit companies under the Companies Act. But when we looked at the ordinance, the parent, let's say, statute which creates Grameen Bank, that statute does not permit Grameen Bank to create any other organization. It's strictly debarred. And yet they went on creating one after another. In fact, Professor Yunus, in a board meeting himself, has recorded that he could not have created these, could not have done this kind of work within the Grameen Bank structure itself. And then he goes on to record that I've had to create these. The Bengali word he has used is Srishti Kora, which means to create these organizations in order to undertake these activities under the umbrella of Grameen Bank. Effectively, what he has done is that under our law, these are ab initio illegal, and that none of these can be sustained under the legal banner because they were not permitted to create. They have created it, poured a lot of money into it. They operate fine, but they are not really legal entities. Now, what we can do with these is something which the Commission will try and determine. Amongst them is one organization we found. It's called Grameen Telecom. They currently own 35% of shares of the largest mobile telephone operator in Bangladesh. It's called Grameen Phone Limited. And a large chunk of the dividends that Grameen Telecom come is now being poured into a trust created again by Grameen Telecom itself. It's called the Grameen Telecom Trust. And from the trust, a good portion of that money is now being invested in what Professor Yunus calls the social business. What he's created right now, the social business aspects of Grameen Bank. So these, as we have found, are all illegal. We don't know what to do with this, particularly because Grameen Phone Limited itself is such a large organization. It's the largest foreign investor in Bangladesh right now. To say that they are illegally operating is to create a major problem for us. they are actually technically illegally operating. But we have to find a way. We've given them a solution, and we wait to see what government says about it. Do we have anything else? No, this is what I've already mentioned. One other thing that I'd like to let you know is that Grameen Bank has been issuing guarantees to its sister organizations. So when Grameen Telecom was set up and it didn't have capital, it required money to buy these shares or contribute to the Grameen phone organizations. What he did is effectively, in one case, he went to Soros, asked Soros to lend money so that he could sell up the telecommunication company. Soros in turn said, I need a guarantee that the money that I'm investing is good. So he used Grameen Bank's goodwill and authority to guarantee that loan. And then Soros Development Fund provided the money to start a Grameen Telecom. None of this is permitted under the ordinance, but he went and did it. The sad part is that all the authorities who should have been looking into this, they all turned a blind eye to it. The board should have pointed out that he is not permitted to do this. The bank is not permitted under the law to do it. The Ministry of Finance should have stepped in and said, this is not within your purview, you can't do it. The central bank should have stepped in and said, who authorized you to borrow money outside the country and pledge the government's assets for a loan from Soros. Everybody kept quiet. Hence, we are in this bit of a mess right now. We have to try and sort this out. I think at this stage, it would be best if we throw the...
Okay, fine, thank you. Obviously, you could go on for a long time, but I think this gives us a very effective summary. Thank you very much. Maybe we've got a lot of lawyers in the room, and we're sitting in the office of some lawyers, and there's all kinds of legal points which I suspect you'd love to tussle over for hours. May I perhaps ask you not to?
Why do you look at me, Malcolm, when you say that?
I didn't look at you, you're just flattering me. You've said once or twice, we will now go on to recommend this. Is it possible for you to tell us what you are proposing to recommend should be done about this mess, which you've very eloquently described, in a word or two?
Briefly, given the fact that the characteristics of the shares have not been defined.
Can you hear all right? Is this working on?
As I mentioned, the shares of Grameen Bank have no other characteristic except the right to vote for a director. You cannot, under the ordinance, even pay out a dividend. The word dividend doesn't arise, it's not mentioned in the ordinance. So what do we do if the only right is the right to vote for a director, and you have an electoral base which is, according to us, the commission, it's 540,000. According to Professor Yunus, it's at least 5.5 million, or it can be as much as 8.3 million. So we have to try and solve that problem, because he says he has issued shares. Now, if he has issued shares, people who have contributed to this share capital should know what they have contributed to. Bangladesh Bank conducted a survey from amongst these so-called shareholders, and almost none of them could explain what a share meant, what their contribution actually meant for them. They had given 100 taka, and the 100 taka was not, it was only recorded on their passbooks. They have a little passbook in which how much money they borrow and how much money they repay is recorded. And it simply says that a 100 taka share has been issued in their name. Given the fact that a vast majority of these people are illiterate and that they have no idea what a share really means, what characteristics are, we are at a loss to determine how we should treat this share. Now, we have tried our best to, let's say, accommodate Professor Yunus's views, because he is, after all, the founder of Grameen Bank, and he has repeatedly asserted that this is a private bank. In fact, in one of his pamphlets, he has clearly stated that if this is not a private bank and it's a government bank, then the Commission should try and make it a private bank. So in our initial options that we had thought of, there were two scenarios. One scenario was that we'd allow that to continue as a government bank. We would recognize the contribution to the share capital by these borrower shareholders, but they would have only a minority shareholding in the bank's capital itself. They would not have the controlling authority to manage the bank. Effectively, it would be a government bank. The other option that we thought of is that we would recommend a decentralization of the banks. There was really no need to have such a large central structure, because the bank actually operates at the village level. And there are 40 or more profit centers. So each profit center could be converted to a mini bank, and they would all be regulated by a central authority. Professor Yunus does not seem to have accepted that option either. But he keeps repeating that make it a private bank. If we have to make it a private bank, we can only do it under the Companies Act. He has to spell out what do we do with the shareholders, even if we start defining what a share means. That they have a right to vote, that they have a right to get a dividend, that they have a right to transfer the shares or not transfer the share. All of this has to be spelled out. None of this is spelled out. But then how do we get them to participate in the election of the director? By proxy vote, by a staggered voting system, whatever. None of this has been spelled out. And so we're trying to figure out what to do with this. Basically, these are the two options that we are thinking of right now. We are open to any suggestions that come.
Maybe you'll get some from this room, who knows. So thank you. Can I, and please identify yourself, and please don't make statements, ask questions briefly.
My name is Siddiqui. My question is to the Chairman of the Commission, Mr. Mahmood Rashid. You have pointed out the technical irregularities and various illegalities, as you say, in the structure of the bank, as distinct because of the fact that it was created through an ordinance. But is there any proof that Professor Yunus siphoned off money from that bank, from that system, or that it remains a question of structure and organizational weaknesses?
Thank you. That's a good. Yeah, perhaps you could deal with that.
Yeah, right away. The Commission has strictly avoided dealing with any issue which has to touch on Professor Yunus's personal role in this, other than his role in the bank itself. The siphoning of money is, of course, it's just sensationalizing what had happened. So far, we have not found Professor Yunus personally benefiting from any of these activities. So far, I will say, because we haven't completed our report as yet. We haven't found any evidence to that effect. But the fact still remains, this is a state organization. It has to continue operating beyond Professor Yunus's tenure. And we need to find a way to keep this sustained and working properly. It cannot be personality-based. It has been personality-based. His presence there is so overwhelming that, as you can see, the board used to keep quiet, the ministry used to keep quiet, the central bank refused to intervene, and ever since he's got the Nobel Prize, that influence has become even more overwhelming. Nobody seems to want to speak up and say, this is improperly done, this should not have been done this way, an alternative path has to be found. But as I say, thus far, we have not found any evidence that he has personally benefited from any of these activities. even if they are illegal, not in accordance with the laws of the country or the ordinance itself.
Maybe I could add to that that in my reading of the report, there's no innuendo that he has either. You don't even make that implication, which you might have done, but you don't. More questions? Sir.
Hello. My name is Asim Choptai. What I feel here, is the same thing as happened to Royal Bank of Scotland. There was one person, Fred the Shred, who was thinking, that he can do whatever he likes. And so, the main thing is to nationalize the whole institution so that all the Bangladeshis are the shareholders of the bank. And that is the only way to go ahead, to nationalize it so that every Bangladeshi is a shareholder of that bank. And then when things are materialized and done well, then you can make it a privatized bank. And that is the only way forward. Otherwise, it will continue as it is.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Are there any other, just following on that suggestion, are there any other perhaps different recommendations? Because I think it would be nice if our friends could go away with some suggestions. Yeah.
Am I right in understanding that Professor Yunus would like to have the organisation and the financial benefit of the organisation for what he calls the members, i.e. the client base of his organisation? That's just a very quick first question, because then I've got to follow up.
A very quick
response
answer to your first question is, he repeats that he wants the bank to be privatized.
Irrespective
but then he doesn't say what
that.
privatization means.
Okay, but the reason why I ask this is because my understanding is that he set up this organisation, bearing in mind originally that the members of the organisation would effectively benefit financially.
There is no evidence to that effect. When the bank was set up, it was a state parastatal organization. It was originally a project of the central bank, and it was the central bank which initially gave the capital for this organization. There were, of course, contributions from the project borrower shareholders, but the major chunk of the capital at the initial stages came from the central bank. But there is no record that it was government ever envisaged that this would be a private bank.
So
and the ordinance was not designed. There would have been some indication that when the bank reached this stage, effectively the shareholders would take over. There is no evidence. The ordinance does not say so.
So if you were to add up over the years who has contributed what amounts of bits of capital, being the central bank or the state, as well as the members with all their tiny little amounts for shares, then you should be able to come up with the total amount, irrespective of a dispute of whether or not the capital was legally submitted and paid in as share capital, or whether it was not paid in because it was allocated as a deposit. Let's say that you take the benefit of doubt for the people of Bangladesh who are customers. Yeah? The government works on behalf of the people of the nation. So therefore, you might find that it might be useful for the government to say, from a PR point of view, we will allocate the shares and the financial wealth that we manage to receive from a privatization in the future back to the people who were possibly shareholders. That way you make sure that there's complete transparency from the government's point of view, so that not all the money goes towards the government, who can then freely decide to pay out any of those monies, but that you actually have a clear, transparent audit trail to who those monies go to.
Demutualisation like the British building societies in
Yes,
some ways,
exactly.
which is a very good precedent, yes. Yes, do you want to deal with that?
Very quick answer. You see, the whole presumption is that a share has been defined. This share is not defined. You're using a term in the context of the Companies Act, but it's not relevant to this ordinance.
I understand that, but you've done a fantastic report and you've done a fantastic presentation as well, whereby it is very clear that legally this is a lawyer's dream, but it is a legal nightmare. And so effectively you've got to take off your legal cap and look at it from a business perspective, I think.
I'm not a legal person. One of my members is a QC. He is the legal mind. The people who drafted the ordinance happens to be a very senior barrister in the country and a doctorate in civil law from Oxford. So that doesn't tell you very much. But if he has drafted this and we've come up here, it doesn't tell you very much. But that's not the point. The point is simply this. We are not adverse towards recommending that there should be a private organization. But somebody has to tell us how to do it. I mean, it's not enough to say privatize it, as Professor Yunus is saying. To privatize it, it has to be under some legal structure. Either it has to be under the Companies Act, or the Cooperatives Act, or a trust, or even under this Act, where you define all these terms. A share means this. This is its value. This is how you transfer it. Here are the rights that emanate from the share. It's not mentioned. So simply to use the term share and say that I am the owner of the bank because I own a single share here is incorrect. So it all begins from the mistake that was made when drafting the ordinance. We have not defined the term share is not defined itself here, other than by saying that a borrower shareholder has the right to vote for a director. So where do we go from here? It's not that we don't want to do it. We're quite open to it. But either we made the offer to Professor Yunus to please tell us how to do it. He has not said anything in 6 months.
Well, I'm sure for a suitable fee, the lady in the front will tell you how to do it. Yes, Monica.
She's dying to ask the question.
I am dying to ask the question because you keep bashing lawyers. But my name is Monica Gogner. I'm a partner at Pinsent Masons, another law firm. I guess my question is really more of an observation and then a question. It's very interesting what you write in the report, but I really think there is, and you allude to it in your summary, but there's a bit missing there, which I think you allude to in terms of Fred the Shred. The regulator and the government is at fault here.
Sure.
Irrespective of what kind of, but irrespective of what kind of structure, it is, whether it's a government or a private structure, the regulator is at fault. So when you ask the open question, well, Professor Yunus doesn't tell us what a share means, actually I would flip it round and say, well, why does the government not come up with what a share means?
Exactly. I agree with you.
And not just that, there's a massive mis-selling scandal here too. And that's not a lawyer fishing, but there is. When you say to me, a shareholder doesn't understand the definition of a share, that to me is a mis-selling scandal which also needs to be looked at.
Oh, it isn't. You see, if you ask a shareholder, any ordinary shareholder, you have bought a share, what do you expect? When this bank was started, in the very first meeting of the board, a nominated shareholder, an illiterate woman, sat on the board, and her observations are recorded in the minutes. Her first observation was, I've given you the 100, what do I get in return? Which is exactly what person buys a share for, a return on the share. So even if she was illiterate, she knew that her investment, 100 taka, she was going to expect a return. That's the only point in the entire 90 board meetings that they've had where a borrower shareholder actually came up and said, yeah, I'm giving you this 100, what do I get in return? Now,
but isn't that your solution, though?
What was the answer?
They didn't answer the question. It's never, in the 90 meetings that followed, nobody alluded to this.
But surely that's your solution. If you're saying that there isn't a mis-selling scandal because the shareholder knew what they were buying, and what they were actually buying was a share in a bank where they'd get a profit, then in the spirit of what we've just mentioned, then that's your solution, surely.
I agree with you. You see, quite often that 100 taka share that they were buying was more in the form of a deposit, the right to continue to borrow from them. So if you treat that as a deposit and a right to continue to operate within the bank, that's fine. The bank does not depend on the shares to operate. It depends on a certain amount of deposit which they can relend. Shares itself is not important. Even if there were no shares and the government contributed to the bank a deposit against which they could lend, the bank would continue to operate.
So are you saying the shareholders are not shareholders, they're actually just depositors?
Exactly.
Ma'am, the lady before us.
Okay, my name is Nana Badri Banton and I'm a founder of a small microfinance organisation in Ghana. And from what you've presented, it's been really helpful, but it seems to me that a lot of things have been done in good faith in terms of what has been set up and what's been achieved by the Grameen Bank. It's almost like an entrepreneur's kind of dream and vision. And in terms of, I think that what's being done for the people in terms of the clients is a good thing, and I think everybody accepts that. Well, yes or no, I don't know.
We do.
But the thing is that something that you said which was very touching for me is that it wasn't envisaged that Grameen would have grown to what it is today. And so for me, the question isn't really whether it's going to be, what the legal structure is. I'm not a lawyer at all. But my question is, what are the pros and cons of whether it's privatized as a company or whether it remains, not remains in limbo, or what are the benefits for the client 10, 20, 30, 40 years, the next generations what I'm saying is that the mistake that was made at the beginning was that it was a short-term vision. And I hope that the vision now isn't going to be short-term, just looking at the mistakes that have been made, but is going to look generationally, so that 2, 3 generations from now, the same arguments aren't happening. Is that what's being done?
What we're trying to do is to point out that an organization which has become so big, it's become very big. I have a client base of 8.3 million. It's big by any standards. In Bangladesh, it's also very big. The point is, Professor Yunus's personality, being the founder, and he's an extremely charismatic person, he could run it. I suppose he could run another 10 years if he lived another 10 years. He could. Sheer force of personality. But one has to look beyond Professor Yunus. If the organization has to be sustained and his experiment has to be honored, then he has to look beyond it. In fact, these are the very words I put across to him, or the commission put across to him, and said, you tell us what the bank should be beyond yourself. And he didn't have an answer to that. I keep repeating the question to him. You've got to tell us, what do you do with this? Do you want this monolithic structure of 8 or 10 million borrower shareholders? Or would you want to do something else with it? And we put this question out. We tried to have a workshop 3 weeks ago. It was shot down by Professor Yunus. He made a big noise in the country saying that they are destroying Grameen Bank by trying to split it or make it a government bank. And we just kept quiet. We said, fine, if you don't want to have a discussion on this, we will make our recommendations regardless of what you say. The other option was, rather than have a monolithic structure, is to have many mini Grameen banks all over the country. Each profit center can be a bank by itself. There is no need to have a single monolithic structure. And each mini Grameen bank would have at least 4 directors. Now, one of the objects of running Grameen Bank in the model that he has done is to empower women. We have not mentioned that. Other than providing collateral-free credit to the landless people, one major impact which is also not envisaged in the very early stages is that it empowers women. And in fact, we have now gone away from the credit lending stage. We have tried to emphasize the good that this bank has done in empowering women in the countryside. So if you have to empower women, and one form of empowerment is to bring them onto the board of the bank so that they can participate in its deliberations. Why 9 out of 8 million? There are only 9 and there is an 8 million base. We've said split it into smaller banks. This is one of the options. And in each bank you would have at least 4 to 5. So you would have 200 women participating in 200 little mini banks throughout the country. I think that would provide greater empowerment. Unfortunately, Professor Yunus doesn't seem to exist.
What would you do with Grameen Telecom, etc., etc., etc.?
All right.
The other 50, sorry.
We'll come back to that later.
Okay.
Anything about Grameen Bank?
Yes.
The role of the commission. There are times when you were talking tonight, you sound like a traditional commission where you come up with recommendations for the government to solve this problem.
Options.
Options, okay. 2 questions. One is, do you have any confidence that the Prime Minister of Bangladesh would actually implement your recommendations? Because, the reason I ask this is because for my home country in the United States, we've had commissions to solve big problems, and the President of the United States decides that, said, thank you very much, puts it on the shelf and nothing happens. So what confidence do you have that your recommendation or options will be actually implemented? Okay? Because if they're not implemented, the problem continues.
Good. It's not our job to implement it.
I understand.
Our job is to recommend. The right and authority to accept or reject or modify lies with the government, which created the. Between us and the government, there is a clear divide. We made it quite clear to the government. Two issues which we made clear to the government is, first, our recommendations will not be amended before they are put to the public. And they've been very nice. They put it on the website the day we put it to the government. I don't know of any other commission's report which has been put immediately on the website without the government tampering with it. Whether the government this is just the first part. What Grameen Bank is, what it should be is the second part. They have not tampered with this. Whether they accept this or not, I cannot vouch for it. That's the government's prerogative, and we leave it at that. Once the commission is over, I'll be free to speak personally, but not at this stage. At this stage, I just represent the three-member commission that has been formed here. So I will not comment on whether the government will or will not. May or may not. That's their prerogative. They run the government. They have the right to decide what to do.
Inshallah.
I have a question. Malcolm, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So I'm Phyllis Santamaria from Microfinance Without Borders. I have had a chance to look at your report. And so on pages 133 to 135 of your interim report, you say that Telenor has unlawfully deprived the poor landless women members of Grameen Bank of substantial assets and income from Grameen Telephone. And I've heard this is over $1 billion US. Is there any way that you can explain how this has happened? And, what you think
enough.
about it?
Thank you. Explain.
I'll do that, but if there is no any other, this is a part of the 52 organizations. I'll beg your indulgence. If we finish with Grameen Bank itself, then I'll move to the 52
Okay, any other questions about
on
Grameen
Bank
Yeah,
itself.
fair enough. Yes, at the back, sir.
My name's Mona Sonpa. I've worked with colleagues in the Microfinance Club. I also have a banking background and a regulatory background. My question is that if you do decide to split into, I don't know how many smaller banks. X number. From my experience, a small country trying to regulate a lot of banks, I mean, there is a definite slowdown in the way the banks operate, the procedures, and the ability to actually service the clients. And so how much emphasis is actually being placed on understanding the impact on actually serving the customers by trying to go down that road, and also the pressure to regulate that number of institutions?
It's a very good question. Here is what we thought of. We have another organization called the Rural Electrification Board. Now, the REB was set up on a model developed in the USA, NRECA. I'm just diverging, just to draw an analogy. Under the NRECA system, there are these village cooperatives who actually distribute electricity to the individual households. And these village cooperatives are independent, legally independent bodies. People who want electricity, they join the cooperative, they're given electricity, they pay for it. And the central body simply ensures that there is uniformity in the distribution of electricity. The power system is uniform all through. We tried to draw an analogy from that for Grameen Bank. Each independent mini Grameen Bank would be a legal entity by itself. And the central Grameen Bank board that exists right now would be the regulator of these mini Grameen banks. The central bank will not stand in as a regulator of these mini Grameen banks. The Grameen Bank itself would regulate its mini branches. But the mini branches would be independent bodies. They are not independent right now. They're simply a branch of the central bank. So if you have this structure, if this is an option that government accepts, each profit center would be an independent organization in which they would have elections, local elections. The funds that they would raise locally would be spent locally, would be utilized locally. And if they had to lend to a sister Grameen bank, they would do so at market rates. So independent banks operating, but the central body would be there to ensure that these branches are, these banks, independent mini banks, are adequately regulated by itself. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Therefore, that would imply that this big central Grameen bank is kind of acting as a regulator and therefore is a governmental, effectively granted the power by the government. So de facto, it's nationalizing.
No, it isn't. We go back again. A regulator has to be a part of the government structure. A regulator cannot be a private regulator. Private regulators have made big messes wherever they have been allowed to do so. So a regulator has to be a part of the state structure. But the many Grameen banks are legally independent entities.
Could we use the analogy of there being franchisees, as it were,
That's right, sir.
of the centre, and the centre would exist to manage the franchise, but still there would be supervision from the government?
There would be.
I would give the example actually of a recognised investment exchange in the UK system. And that is where you have basically the UK regulator who would regulate, for example, the London Metal Exchange, which is a recognised investment exchange.
Phyllis, never mind.
And
It's
under
a
that they
distraction.
have members.
Okay.
So it would be very similar in structure.
Yeah.
And maybe you need, what you need is actually a combination of that with the credit union structure, which reflects the membership and the directors that you've already got. So maybe it's a combination of both of those.
You could do that, but the principle has to be accepted that a monolithic structure is no longer suitable for a clientele base which numbers in 8 to 10 million. That's all that we're saying.
Lady at the back there, on the middle.
It's related to this. I actually did, my name is Radhika Dabari. I did my dissertation looking very closely at Grameen's bank, and I just had a question in terms of, in relation to this, of whether the numbers were looked at of the actual finances of each of these little banks, because you're recommending that you make the little banks, which then will be regulated. However, from what I found, and I don't know, naturally, I'm sure you've looked into the numbers a lot more than I did at the time, that the finances of each of these separate banks are quite varied on whether they're making profits or making losses, actually, if you look at the numbers. So how would you be dealing with that if you were to separate the separate banks?
There is no assumption that all these mini banks will be equally profitable. That goes against the very principle of decentralizing them. In other words, what you're saying is that as things stand right now, some profit centers are subsidizing some other profit centers. And they are doing it indirectly without knowing it. So some poor person in X district is subsidizing the work of some other district profit center. What we are saying is you make it explicit. If the branch is not profitable, government should step in, put in some more capital, make it work better. But this indirect subsidization is not an appropriate way of allowing these profit centers to operate. Once you have an independent entity, then those people understand that we are not profitable, we are not contributing to capital, we are not providing the returns, and therefore government is subsidizing us.
The gentleman behind.
With regards to why you separating the telecom side from the banking side, because after all, excuse me.
Sorry,
The telecom side is troubling you.
Sorry, it's just when you mentioned that some many parts of, if you break up the larger companies, some of the smaller sides might be unprofitable. But yet, if the smaller parts have contributed to the setting up of the telecom company as a whole, then surely that should be formed part of the whole overall group.
We'll come back to that. That's the 52 organizations.
We'll come back to the non-banking side in a moment. Yeah,
hi, Nish Katecha. Question I have is Grameen Bank viable? With the Commission finishing their report and no one really in charge, is there a risk to its stability?
You mean, is it financially viable right now? Right now?
Yep.
Well, the auditors say it's financially viable.
That's not beyond.
The point is to say whether it's financially viable in the space of time that we've been given, it'll be very difficult to answer that question. So we have to rely on the auditors. In spite of all the mistakes that the auditors have done, we have to rely on the chartered auditors. And we have no evidence from what they have said that the bank itself is, as of now, not a viable organization. As I said, based on what they have said. If you want a more detailed study, government will have to give us more time. It's as simple as that.
Fair enough. And just on a separate point,
Sure.
if you want to look at a regulator who does know how to regulate a large number of nationalised banks with a large number of customers, you've got the best example across the border in the RBI.
In where?
Reserve Bank of India. They know what they're
Doing what?
doing. It's the best example.
Making a mess of regulating lots of banks.
Oh,
Yes,
I
excellent
completely
example.
disagree with you.
Yeah, well,
Completely. And if you start really digging, you'll see why. But they have a very good example and a very good model.
Well, I was in Gujarat 3 weeks ago. I spoke to the people there. They didn't have too many flattering things to say about the RBI. Now, I have not studied RBI, and I have not studied the Indian rural credit system in any depth at all to comment on that. I'm just telling you what their feeling was about RBI's role in providing rural credit to the
May
millions in
we
India.
ban further discussion of the Reserve Bank of India? Sir, you have a question?
My name is Hom. If I may ask a simple question, but I'll give a little pretext to it. We see Bangladesh as a country which has enormous potential and which has problems like any other country, including England or Britain, and which has also shown a good solution to the future, like what the textile industry is doing, despite the difficulties. And there are two leaders. Now, all these discussions, finance and business, and all this triggers into philosophical discussion, and philosophy, when divided into different areas, comes into different faculties of topics. I'm suspecting whether there is a kind of a political tussle between the two ladies, and there was a rumor, there was a news that Professor Yunus wanted to become a political leader at one time, and he has been kept quiet, or I think he kept quiet himself. What I'm trying to get out here is, I can feel the sense of kind of energy here in this hall also. Yes, Professor Yunus is an enormous figure. Everybody reveres him. And that's what we know. Nothing do we know more than that. Because we see him on the television, we see him in the newspaper, and Nobel Prize giving has given him a... My question is, you see, how do we empower the people? This country's financial situation has gone so much down the drain. It's because...
Sorry, what is your question?
My question, sir, is this, that how does Grameen Bank, including your commission, including the government, think to empower the individual people? Therefore, every single individual people who are implicated or associated with the Grameen can all benefit, as well as it also preserves the beauty that it has maintained, alongside with all of us together in it. That's my question.
Thank you.
Mr. Hom, very quickly, it's not within the Commission's mandate to answer those questions. We have to stick to our mandate. That's not what we were set up for. So, unfortunately, I can't really answer your question from the Commission's point of view.
No, please, can we...
One second, sir. My worry is, here in this country, with lots of regulations and systems, if you ask each individual, the bank does not treat the people as their customers. As a result, we see the economic situation.
Excuse me, sir, can we will continue this discussion over drink afterwards. Thank you, sir, very much. Thank you. Further questions? Yes, sir, ma'am, sorry.
Hi. Can I just clarify, it's following up on the capital point. Sorry, my name's Leslie Sherratt at King's College. I think you said in the presentation, if I wrote it down correctly, that Grameen has legally only 72 million taka of paid up capital and a 68 billion taka loan portfolio. Those numbers are shocking, if I heard them correctly, and perhaps I misheard them, because it would mean that for any future of Grameen Bank, it would need to raise a very great deal of capital to operate going forward, which would essentially make the problem of existing shareholders or not shareholders irrelevant, because they'd be diluted out of sight in a proper capital raising.
If we stick to the single monolithic structure, then those numbers make problems for it. But if we decentralize, and decentralize is often a better mode of managing such large organizations, particularly at the grassroots, then the problem has a different dimension altogether. 7.2 is in relation to what is legally their subscribed capital and what they claim to be their capital which they have raised. They say they have raised money from 8 million borrower shareholders. But we do not recognize them because under the law, they can only have 540,000 shareholders. So there is a big dichotomy out there.
If the numbers are correct, this point is actually very valid and means that therefore the bank is technically bankrupt, which effectively means that the shareholders have nothing more to say, which effectively means that the ownership goes to the deposit holders. Therefore, it goes to the members of the client base.
It's a government organization. It's owned by the government. The government, we've recommended the government guarantee the funds put into the bank by the depositors. So their deposit, whether in the form of a deposit or in the form of share, is guaranteed. So that problem does not arise at all. Here the question is that if the government is to operate as a single monolithic structure, this capital base is insufficient, 7.2. It has to raise it. So if you raise it, how do you raise it? By increasing the number of shareholders? If you do increase the number of shareholders, as you would do under the Companies Act, you need to empower them by giving them a right to vote, giving them the audited balance sheets, asking them to participate in the annual activities. How do you do it in a village scenario? What would happen in that scenario is that people will garner these votes. They'll buy the votes out, use the proxy votes to capture the bank. So, you know, there are problems by having such a large voter base and shareholders not necessarily interested in the shares. What does the ordinary, from what we've seen and heard, what does the ordinary borrower shareholder want? Access to collateral-free capital. To get access to collateral-free capital, that person does not have to be a shareholder, does not have to exercise the right to vote. That's irrelevant for those people at that level. They want money without having to mortgage their personal properties. Money to put into productive purposes. Vote is irrelevant for them. In fact, they never vote, as we pointed out, as Professor Yunus has recorded in the minutes, that it's all a selective process.
I'm allowed one further question. I'm afraid we've debarred discussion of the 50, including Grameen Phone, non-banking aspects. I think we'd better postpone those until maybe the next session or over drinks afterwards. But are there any further questions about the bank itself?
I just want to know that in the statute or the ordinance by which the bank was established, you say that 3% was government's share.
No, it started at 60-40.
60-40.
Yeah.
And was that contributed to the bank?
The government contributed shares. The government provided the personnel. Government provided everything.
Capital also?
Yes. Everything came from the capital. But in the ordinance and in the papers which prepared the ordinance, there is no mention, not even Professor Yunus putting up a paper that after you have established this bank, after X number of years, I would like to make it a private bank. There is no indication in the records. It just developed that way.
Can I just put in one point?
Yes, please.
At that time, Grameen Bank did not have any money. Even the Grameen Bank members' contribution was made by the government. So effectively 60% government owns, but 100% was contributed by the government.
Thank you. I'm afraid I've got to bring this to a close because I'm getting signals over here. And I'm sorry, you have one further?
No, a quick word because...
Yeah, by all means.
I don't want... there was a question about the Grameen Telecom.
Oh, okay.
Very briefly. Grameen Telecom was set up by Grameen Bank. Professor Yunus explicitly says so in the minutes of the Grameen Bank board meeting. Hence, it is a subsidiary of Grameen Bank. But when he set it up as a non-for-profit company under the Companies Act. Now, the capital to this non-for-profit company came from Grameen Bank's funds. The setting up of the organization was illegal. The charter does not provide it. The diversion of funds from Grameen Bank to this organization was illegal because Grameen Bank's funds can only be given to the poor, landless, in a collateral-free manner. He is not authorized to do that. The board just kept quiet. We mentioned it. It's the board which should have stepped in and said, you can't do this. Now, not only was that organization set up in an illegal manner, it then sponsored a project to provide mobile telephones, and it used the Grameen apparatus. You see, why did Grameen phone expand so rapidly? Because they used these women in the villages. They provided them with telephones, and that's how it spread throughout the country. It's one of the largest telephone bases anywhere in the world at the village level. They used the Grameen apparatus to expand their operations. So that is as far as the Grameen it's illegal. The contribution to its capital was illegal. And when he got the license, he means Grameen Phone got the license, Professor Yunus is on record as having petitioned that the benefits of this mobile telecommunication license will flow directly to the members of Grameen Bank. It didn't. It went to this independent organization, Grameen Telecom, which then set up a Grameen Telecom Trust, which then has, which we say 700 crore taka deposits.
You want us 700 crores is 7,000 million, which is $700 million, I think.
$700 million in fixed deposits in banks, and about, our estimate is about 3,000 acres of land, which they bought up. Now, he may be doing very good work, but this is not what the charter asked him to do, and this is not what is to the benefit of the Grameen Bank members. Now, the last thing is about the license which you had asked. You see, when they, this is very unfortunate, very embarrassing. When they applied for the license, they applied under the title Grameen Phone Consortium. Now, there were three parties to that license. Telenor of Norway was one, Grameen Telecom was the other, and a small company from New York called Gonophone was the third. Now, when they applied for the license, they applied on the basis of an MOU amongst all three of them, and the last line of the MOU says that this is a non-binding MOU on the three parties. A non-binding agreement has no legal validity. And in spite of saying that, the government continued to accept their tender and grant them the license. So ab initio, this tender was invalid. Not only was it invalid, a year later, when this paper was put up to the eminent barrister who was their legal advisor, he gave a legal opinion that the organization is an illegal entity. In spite of that, they continued doing this. So the license itself could not have been bid by this organization, and its conversion into a telecommunication giant, what it is now, was entirely based on false premises. Point is that it's the largest foreign investor in Bangladesh right now. If it is to be dissolved, it has major repercussions. We've recommended here that, the third point is, in that MOU, Telenor of Norway had promised that after 6 years of operations, they will divest 16% of their shares and offer it to Grameen Telecom, which is really for the benefits of these poor landless people. 6 years after operations, they reneged on this. Professor Yunus, unfortunately, is on record to have gone to Norway and to have chided Telenor for having reneged on this record. It's all over the Wall Street Journal. You just have to open the website and you will see his comments about them. They reneged and they never divested themselves of the 16%. Now, if you add up the value of the 16% from the year 2002 until today, plus all the dividends that have been paid out to them, plus all the ancillary benefits that have accrued to this bank, an estimate between $500 to $1 billion, which should have gone to the Grameen Bank, is not there. But the most surprising thing is that in the last 2 weeks, these 9 women shareholders have been clamoring, saying, we don't want the money. Who is asking them to make a statement like this? They have gone on record when we put this thing across to them that this money belongs to the 8 million members. We want it back from Norway. These 9 women shareholders that have issued a press statement, we are not interested in that money. Let me tell you, I mean, you are free to infer why they have made a statement like that.
This is a difficult point at which to terminate the meeting, but I'm compelled to. I think we're talking about work in progress. This is not a finished story. It'll go on for a while. I think it's appropriate to make the points as we are the guests of a firm of lawyers, that how much better it would have been if even nasty lawyers, aren't any nice ones of course, had been involved in this from the beginning. Of so many issues, and I see this in India all the time, in property, banking, all kinds of things, that getting things clear on day one is much less expensive in tears and also in legal fees than trying to sort it out 20, 30 years down the road. So I didn't think this evening session would be an investment for the legal profession, but I think in some sense it is.
Thank you,
And thank you both very much for being with us, and let's hope
Andreas, you're a former banker and you've been involved with microfinance for a while. What did you think about tonight's presentation?
I think it was very, very interesting, and also it's obvious that there are two sides to the coin. It's very often the case when a visionary is starting up with an idea and it grows and it becomes a larger entity, that you run into problems because it's run by one person.
And what do you think? What do you think could have been done earlier to avoid this? Because you've seen similar situations in other organizations.
Absolutely. I think that at an earlier stage, the company should have been organized in a much more professional manner, and these problems that they're finding now should have been addressed much earlier.
All right. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Yes, right.
Nish Katecha.
Hi, Nish, and I'm Phyllis Santamaria. So you were at tonight's presentation. What did you think of it?
It's very interesting. It's rare that you get a chance to see the other side. I think it goes back to the general challenge we've had in microfinance, which is for hype. Right? And, Grameen may be a big contributor to the hype. There's a lot of hard work and a lot of effort that needs to go in to actually make micro-lending, which is what this is, work. And the hype itself is not sufficient. And I think what you're seeing is a demonstration of where hype overtook the fundamental foundations that you need to create in order to make a lasting institution a lasting difference. Now, whether the government took it over for the right reason or the reasons, I can't comment, but it just seems the report hit upon some very basic fundamental issues that would have stalled Grameen tomorrow if it hadn't happened today. So that institution itself was flawed, right? And as a bellwether or a lightning rod for driving microcredit forward around the world, it's a real disappointment. But they have an opportunity to clean it up.
Yes, that's right. That's really important. Well, one of the other things is that I know that micro savings are a really important thing. And Grameen, before they had this crisis, when they could now they can only do lending, that they did have a way that people could do voluntary savings. So that's something that they're being stopped from doing right now.
But savings, there is a flaw in the savings model when it's being done like this.
Well, yes, when it's done this way.
Well,
yes.
it's being, when savings are being done in an institution that does not have a capital of capital adequacy, it's not set up properly to protect those savings, and you're relying on a government to protect it should something happen, how can you take that risk with this type of customer?
That's true.
It's flawed. Savings being done by NGOs and charities is flawed unless they offer the right deposit protection. That's what a regulator is there for, and that's why when you set up a bank they demand large level of capital. It's not because they want to, it's because they want to protect the people. Now the question comes back to the people who need protecting at the middle level, they need a capital adequacy of 10. When you go down the spectrum, what type of protection should they have from their institutions? Is it 20, is it 30 units, 40 units? What level? Because should you fall over as an institution when you have their deposits in your hand and you take them with you, you take generations away.
That's true.
And that's not acceptable in anyone's language. Right? So the enthusiasm, which I cannot floor, the motivation of people setting up these types of institutions is brilliant because they're trying to solve a localised problem. If they don't do it with the right foundations, we're all going to be answered to it.
Yes, that's true. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Monica Gogner, partner at Pinsent Masons.
Right, and I'm Phyllis Santamaria from MicroFinance Without Borders. And Monica, I just wanted to know what you thought about tonight's presentation, because it was certainly very stimulating. What did you think?
I thought it was extremely stimulating. I think there were a number of points that came out from the presentation which I particularly found interesting as a lawyer, and a lot of them were to do with the comment at the end actually about wouldn't it have been better if the structure had been thought about before and put on paper. But leaving that to one side, I think it's now about, okay, how do we create solutions? And I actually like the fact that the Commission are being quite open and saying...
Yeah, they are,
yeah, yeah, they're being really sensible. They're saying, we don't know all the answers, but these are the options that we think may be useful. Why don't we consider it? And why don't we really sort of try and do the best for those shareholders or depositors or members or whatever you want to call them, the best for them too, whilst also paying respect to Professor Yunus as well, which I think is quite important.
Right. So as a lawyer, you really appreciated that. They're saying, Malcolm's saying that there could have been a role for lawyers a lot earlier in this process.
Yeah. I know that it was sort of dismissed, but I am a little bit worried about the potential mis-selling, because I do worry that, you know, these are relatively uneducated women in sort of the agricultural lands, and they really were sort of investing in microfinance and in Grameen Bank through trust. And perhaps they didn't really understand what the share meant or what was required. I think it's good to hear that they thought that they'd get something back, and it's good to hear that that's recorded somewhere. But I do wonder whether there does need to be more scrutiny as to the practices that we used to entice these women primarily to invest really in this bank.
Right. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
So I'm Radhika Tabari, and I'm actually working for Foods Healthcare at the moment, and I was a graduate from Aston University.
From?
Aston University.
Aston University. And you did a dissertation about microfinance?
I did
What, for
indeed.
your master's?
No, it was actually for my undergrad, but I decided to do a dissertation comparing microfinance organizations between Bolivia and between Bangladesh, and understanding exactly the difference between commercial purpose and charitable purpose.
All right. Oh, good. Right, so what did you think about tonight's presentation? Because it was certainly full of lots of information.
It definitely was.
That's right.
I actually thought it was really great to see that the commissioning board is there to look at and understand Grameen Bank in a more different light and look at the bottom roots of it. I think it was very challenging. I think you could see that from the audience about the different ideas and thoughts of what we believe might have happened and what's actually gone on. But yeah, definitely a great presentation.
Right, and do you have any recommendations about what you think could be done? Any options? Because we talked about a lot of them.
Yes.
Were there any that struck you as particularly fruitful?
I think one that was particularly fruitful is looking at it and remembering it's for the people of Bangladesh, and it's a very poor nation, and it'd be great to understand how we can reorganize it to benefit them. A personal note that I would suggest is understanding education, and the different charitable functions are fantastic. However, one part that has still got to grow with Grameen in general is this education element. If you have illiterate women, maybe the element actually needs to be there to find out how we can reinvest into the education of the population.
Right.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
My name is Masli Ahmed. I'm a member of the Grameen Bank Commission, and professionally I'm a microinsurance specialist.
Right. And I'm Phyllis Santamaria, and we are both co-directors of MicroFinance Without Borders.
That's right. Yes.
Right. So mostly you're taking part as one of the members of this Grameen Bank Commission. And what are some of the, the most interesting aspects of this commission for you?
Well, to start with, the structure of Grameen Bank itself really surprised me, because what we all heard about, and we know, most of the people know, the Grameen Bank is owned by landless women of Bangladesh. It is not so. Grameen Bank, we found out, is owned by the government. And landless women, poor women of Bangladesh are either borrowers or depositors in there. Beyond that, they have nothing else, no stake in Grameen Bank.
Right.
And they don't benefit from Grameen Bank except for getting appropriate loan.
Right. So that was surprising for you.
Very surprising. And it's,
Right.
I think, for the rest of the world as well, because we all have heard throughout that the women, the poor women of Bangladesh, they own Grameen Bank.
Right. Right. So you talked about a lot of options. How much longer is the commission going to do its work?
The commission is going to finish its work on the 20th of this month.
Oh, 20th of July,
July
2013.
That's right. It's, unless the government gets another extension. And we have got, I think, 1 or 2 weeks after that to submit our report.
Right. And we talked a lot tonight about what the chairman of the commission talked about, decentralizing, making, say, different cost centers with Grameen Bank. What do you think about that option?
Well, decentralizing is fine, because that itself is not going to solve the problem.
No.
The basic problem in Grameen Bank is that giving a voting right and ownership to the 8.5 million shareholders, or depositors and members of the company. Whether we split it up into 19 different units or have it in one unit, it does not really solve the problem. We have to go back to the grassroots, and we have to find out how can these women participate in selecting a leader for them, from president at the board level, and run the bank for themselves. So, we can go and say we do 19 banks or one bank. It doesn't matter. There are various options that's been given. One of the options was that have 19 divisions. Another option is to set it up on a cooperative basis, like Amul of India and Seva of India. And he gave an example of Rural Electrification Board as one example.
Yes, he said that would be an analogy about how it could be done.
But beyond that, also there are a few other options that we are talking about. One is to leave Grameen Bank as it is, go back to the main problem. The root problem is a defective ordinance. If that can be solved, if we can go back and solve that problem, make all the corrections in the law that is there so that it can function like Dr. Yunus wants it to. He wants it to run as a private organization. That's another option. I'll come to that. But right now, if we want to leave it as it is, government wants it as a government organization. But it cannot function as a government organization unless we can correct those defects in the ordinance.
So in the actual law of Bangladesh.
Of Bangladesh. Go back and correct it and leave it as it is. Because it is an excellent model. It's a very successful model.
Right.
And there's no point disturbing that. Leave it as it is, let it do what it is doing. Other option that we are also considering is a privatized Grameen Bank, like Dr. Yunus is saying. So it can either be on a PPP basis, public-private participation, government has a stake in it, shareholders have a stake in it. Go back and register it on the Companies Act as a private company, give the shareholders an ownership right, a voting right, and a right to get share of the profit. So I would say there should be 4 options. The other 2 options we have talked about within the Commission. I'm supposed to write those options, and I'm doing it, and we will consider those options and then implement them.
Right, so you're writing 4 options altogether.
That's right.
Right. And then are you also going to be dealing with the issue of Grameen Bank having spawned so many different companies?
Yes.
Are you also going to be offering some options for that?
Well, if we go back and correct the defects that is in ordinance, that will automatically get sorted out.
Right.
Because as of now, the ordinance is not allowing them to do it. So we should go back and correct it, so you're allowed to do it.
Right.
That will sort it out. And again, if we go and become a private organization, that also gets sorted out, because private organizations can make investments the way they want.
Right. Well, it sounds like, to me, from what I heard tonight and what I've seen from reading the interim report, that it was really probably a wise thing for the government to call for this commission. Yes. And it seems to me, from what I heard from the chairman and from you tonight, that they chose some very good members of the commission.
That I don't know, but you know, I think government, it's a good decision of the government to appoint the commission. If I may make another point, you brought up the topic. I don't know if our chairman has sort of, you know, has spoken about and clarified. You brought up the topic of Telenor.
Yes,
that
that's
is a big issue.
Yes, because we're talking about over $1 billion that should belong to the poor landless women.
Yes, and
$1 billion could go a long way.
The government should make an effort to get this money back from Norwegian government. And
Yes.
give it back to the government shouldn't keep it, it should give it to Grameen Bank so that the poor women benefit from that.
Right. So that would be part of one of the options.
This is one of the points that has gone in our report, in the interim report.
Right.
And the government has made an effort to act on it.
Oh, great. Well, congratulations on doing that forensic work, because I know that you personally did a lot of the work, so you uncovered these things. As a chartered accountant, someone with a lot of experience with microfinance and with microinsurance, you know about how to get in under the bonnet of the microfinance car and do that investigating. So congratulations for that.
And a lot of the credit also goes to Martin Rishi.
Yes.
And our other member is a barrister and a QC, Ajmal Hussain. Unfortunately, he's not here today. But we've done, I mean, they have done a lot of work.
As well,
and
yes.
Credit should
well,
go
I mean, it was just so fascinating to hear the presentation tonight, and to me, it was really exciting to see, you know, that now that the issue is being aired, that it's out in the open, and that there are options that can be chosen, and that more benefit can go to the landless women. So that's a great outcome. All right, thank you.